We move to questions without notice. Are there any questions? I'll give the call to the Shadow Treasurer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Can the Treasurer tell Australians by what percentage the cost of food has gone up during Labor's cost of living crisis since the election of the Albanese Labor government?
The call to the Treasurer.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. The nerve of these characters asking about the cost of living after they opposed all of our efforts to help Australians with the cost of living. Now, if you'd been there for Australians when we wanted to give them tax cuts, energy bill relief, cheaper early childhood education, cheaper medicines, better wages, help with rent, if you'd been there for Australians then that would warrant you coming up and asking about the cost of living. Now, as the Prime Minister said in response to this question when you last asked it, if you look at the last year of food inflation, it's 3.0%. If you look at the last year under those opposite, it was 5.9%. 5.9%. And so I appreciate the Shadow Treasurer and his usually comically incompetent way asking me to remind the House that food inflation over the last year is almost precisely half of food inflation under those opposite in their last year, Mr Speaker. Now, on this side of the House, our primary focus is the cost of living. That's why we're rolling out that cost of living help. And if you look at the cost of living index that was released the other day, lower growth in living costs across every household type compared to at the time of the election. And so that is another reminder, Mr Speaker, that although inflation is still too high, although Australians are still under too much pressure, we have made some welcome and encouraging progress in the fight against inflation, and we saw that in the numbers last Wednesday. Now, Mr Speaker, there are two things that makes the Shadow Treasurer really angry. First of all, when inflation goes down, as it did on Wednesday, and secondly, when the public finds out the cost of his policies.
Has the Treasurer completed his answer? The Manager on a point of bit.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. The point of order's relevance. The Treasurer is not even attempting to answer the question. The question was very tight.
Order. Members on my right, that is not how we roll. The Manager is entitled to raise a point of order just like the Leader of the House is or any member is. So that's just not a free-for-all commentary. He's going to be given the respect of the House, and I want to hear what he has to say.
The question was very tight. The question asked the Treasurer how much food prices are up since the election of the government, not the last 12 months, since the election of the government. And if the Treasurer doesn't know the answer, it's 12%.
Look, that may be a fair point, and you may want to make it, but it's not the time to make those kinds of commentary. So I'd ask the Manager not to abuse the lenience that I show him. The Treasurer was asked a question. He's read figures into the Hansard. You may dispute those figures. He may order, and that's for another time that you may question those. But whilst he's reading data into the Hansard, answering the question as he sees fit, maybe not how you see fit, he's entitled to do so under the standing orders. And now he is providing information regarding the question he was asked. So just ask the Manager not to add extra comments or any member to their points of order. In light of what I've said before, just ask the Treasurer to remain directly relevant to the question he was asked.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I asked about food inflation and pointing out that food inflation is currently half what it was when we came to office. And that is another reminder that although Australians are still under pressure, the inflation numbers have been substantially lower and now in a sustained way. And so I know they don't like to hear that. I don't think I've ever seen anyone as unhappy as the Shadow Treasurer on the day last week when inflation came down again and the bottom half of the Reserve Bank's target band, Mr Speaker. So if they are unhappy about the levels of inflation right now, as we are, and we're working to get inflation down, then they must be absolutely furious at their own performance in office, Mr Speaker, which delivered inflation multiples of what it is right now. And so this question is another welcome opportunity to remind people that when cost of living help was being provided by this side of the House, those opposite opposed it. That means that Australians would have been thousands of dollars worse off if this opposition leader had his way, and they'll be even worse off if he wins.
Member for Braddon is warned. We'll hear from the member for Tangney.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister, representing the Prime Minister. How is the Albanese Labor government making progress and prioritising the cost of living for all Australians? What approaches will leave people worse off?
The call to the Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Governing is about priorities, and the priority of the Albanese government from the moment that we took office has been tackling cost of living.
Order.
And we've done this from day one because of global inflation, but also because of the low-wage, high-inflation mess which we inherited from the Liberals. So we've made medicines cheaper, we've made childcare more affordable, we've provided energy bill relief to every Australian. We've got wages going again, beginning with the lowest paid, such that on this day there is now real wage growth in Australia, and we have provided a tax cut to every income earner. We understood that we needed to get inflation down, so we delivered 2 budget surpluses, something those opposite never did, and having inherited a number of 6.1, inflation now is at 2.4%. Now, we get that the last few years have been difficult, and for many Australians they are still doing it tough. And while there is light at the end of the tunnel, there is a lot more work that needs to be done, and we are committed to that. But the Liberals represent a material risk to finishing this job because they have a very different set of priorities. I mean, there is not a culture war that they will not fight. They literally seek to politicise everything, and they've made totally clear their priority is to cut government services to the tune of $350 billion, and they'll need to find another $600 billion to pay for their nuclear plan. Now, you just can't do that unless you start hacking into Medicare, just as the Leader of the Opposition did when he was the Minister for Health. And if the Liberals are allowed to take Australia back to flatlining wages, to a decimated Medicare scheme right there, the household budgets of middle Australians will be absolutely smashed. But don't worry, they do have one cost of living measure. They want all Australians to pay for businesses to provide for free lunches, a policy which could cost up to $10 billion. That is the same amount of money as the Medicare payments to the entirety of our GP workforce. How on earth can that be the right priority? So, as Australia faces a very big decision in the coming months, we know that the Liberals will be focused on themselves and in their own political fortunes. On this side of the House, we make a pledge. It is the focus, it is the priority of Anthony Albanese and his government to provide for the security and the prosperity of every Australian.
The call to the Shadow Treasurer.
My question is to the Treasurer. Can the Treasurer confirm that housing rents have risen 17% during Labor's cost of living crisis since the election of the Albanese Labor government?
Order. Members on my left don't need to add commentary during the question time, and members on my right don't need to give me a running commentary on what you think of the question either. So I'm just going to ask all members that when a question is asked, everyone is heard in silence. And once someone begins saying something, obviously that might spark a reaction. I understand that. We'll just allow everything to follow its natural course. Order. I'll give the call to the Treasurer.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. I can confirm that rents would be higher were it not for our Commonwealth rent assistance. And I would remind the House once again that when this side of the House was there for Australian renters, those opposite described 2 permanent increases in Commonwealth rent assistance as a sugar hit and wasteful spending, Mr Speaker. And it's another welcome opportunity to remind the House and the people at home, Mr Speaker, that when those opposite talk about $350 billion in wasteful spending. Included in that is investment in housing and is 2 consecutive increases in Commonwealth rent assistance. So that rent, Mr Speaker, in the December quarter went up 0.6%, through the year 6.4%, but it would have been higher were it not for the Commonwealth rent assistance that we have been providing and they have been opposing. Now, Mr Speaker, in every question that we've had so far, there's a hint, and the hint is this. When they talk about the $350 billion, when they talk about our cost of living help, they will come after it if they win the election later this year, Mr Speaker. They will come after all of it. But the worst thing about that, that's bad enough as it is. The worst thing about that is that they won't tell Australians all about it until after the election. Now, they have already made it clear that they don't support our Commonwealth rent assistance. 2 rounds of Commonwealth rent assistance, taking some of the edge out of these rental pressures that do exist in our economy, that we do acknowledge are making life harder for people who are in the rental market. That's why we're putting so much effort into building more homes. That's why, when you oppose building more homes, you're standing in the way of renters getting more affordable rents, Mr Speaker. So we're proud of what we've done to provide cost of living help. We remind people once again that if those opposite had their way, inflation would be higher when it comes to rents. Australians would be thousands of dollars worse off, and they'd be even worse off still if they win the election.
The call to the member for Gilmore.
My question is to the Treasurer. How is the Albanese Labor government prioritising help for Australians with the cost of living? Are there alternative approaches that would leave people worse off?
Give the call to the Treasurer.
Well, thanks to the member for Gilmore, not just for her question, but also for maintaining her focus in her community on the cost of living. And that's the focus that we all share on this side of the House. It's a key part of our economic strategy, which is all about relief, repair and reform. And because of that strategy, we're getting inflation down and wages up and keeping unemployment low. And the progress that we've seen on inflation has been substantial, it's been sustained, and we saw that in the numbers I referred to earlier, Mr Speaker, but people are still under pressure. And that's why this cost of living relief is so important. And in our cost of living relief, you see the priorities of this government. Tax cuts and better pay for working people, energy bill relief, cheaper medicines, cheaper early childhood education, free TAFE, help with rent, as I said a moment ago, Mr Speaker. Now, when those opposite opposed all of that, they made their priorities clear as well. They are for lower wages and longer lunches, and they're against cost of living help. So Australians would be worse off by thousands of dollars if they had their way, and they would be worse off still if those opposite were elected into government, Mr Speaker. Now, this has been almost 3 years that they've been in opposition now, and after 3 years they still have no costed, no credible and no coherent economic policies. All they've got is secret costs and secret cuts, Mr Speaker. And they've got a slogan that says that they want to go back. They want to take Australia backwards. And the truth of that, Mr Speaker, is if he gets back, Australians go backwards, Mr Speaker, because the only way that he can find $350 billion in cuts, the only way they can find $600 billion to pay for this nuclear insanity is to come after Medicare again, to come after hospitals again, to come after housing again, to come after wages and pensions again, Mr Speaker, and they won't stop there. And so I think it says it all, Mr Speaker, in this week. It says it all, that in the same week that this health minister and this government invested $1.7 billion more in public hospitals in a single year, we learned that they want to spend $1.6 billion a year with taxpayer-funded long lunches, Mr Speaker. So Australians this year will be asked to choose between 2 very different sets of priorities. That coalition of cuts and conflict and culture wars, coming after Medicare and wages, making people worse off and taking Australia backwards. Or this Labor government making progress on inflation, helping with the cost of living, strengthening Medicare and building Australia's future.
The call to the honourable member for Kooyong.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is for the Minister for the Environment and Water. Minister, on the 21st of May 2022, in his victory speech, the Prime Minister said, "Together we can end the climate wars." Yesterday, your government moved to drop the Environmental Protection Agency off the Senate bill. I ask you, Minister, is this how the climate wars end?
Call to the Minister for the Environment and Water.
Thank you very much to the member for Kooyong and for her question, and also to those other members that are on the crossbench today that actually supported our nature-positive laws when they passed through the House of Representatives. I think everybody agrees that our nature laws need reform. Unfortunately, the Liberals and the Nationals teamed up with the Greens political party to block that in the Senate, just as they teamed up to block the carbon pollution reduction
Leader of the Australian Greens.
And that led to 80 million extra tonnes of carbon dioxide pollution entering our atmosphere. Now, I think Greens political party voters would be surprised to learn that the political party that purports to stand up for the environment wasn't prepared to vote for a strong new cop on the beat, an Environment Protection Agency with strong new powers and penalties. They weren't prepared to vote for better data, more transparency and a world-first definition of nature positive. And I think actually that the Liberals and Nationals voters would be surprised to know that those opposite voted against faster approvals for projects based on better data and more regional planning. What is clear is that if people want real progress on nature law reform, then they have to vote Labor in the House of Representatives and in the Senate as well. We know on this side that if Australians love camping, they love fishing, they love bushwalking, they love boating, they love going for a swim, and we need to preserve nature for the future. We want our kids and our grandkids to be able to see a koala in the wild. That's why we've got to act now, and the difference could not be starker. This side has added more ocean under protection, an area larger than the size of Germany and Italy combined, to the waters under protection. Those opposite cut marine parks. We saved the Great Barrier Reef from an endanger listing. Those opposite have climate policies that put it in danger.
Members on my left.
We have doubled funding to national parks. Those opposite let our national parks fall into disrepair to the extent that there were crocodile warning signs falling onto the ground and missing because those opposite let our national parks decline. We've invested more than $500 million to better protect our threatened species. Those opposite cut funding to the Environment Department by 40%. We're increasing recycling by 1.3 million tonnes a year. Those opposite voted with the Greens to make it easier to export our garbage overseas. Mr Speaker, I really want to thank the member for her question, because she has shown that by working cooperatively we can make progress instead of just blocking.
Concluded. Yeah. Call to the member for Boothby.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Early Childhood Education. How is the Albanese Labor government reforming the early childhood education and care sector to support families? Is there anything that could put this at risk and leave Australians worse off?
Call to the Minister for Early Childhood Education, the Minister for Youth and the Minister assisting the Minister for the National Disability Insurance Scheme.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the wonderful member for Boothby for her question, but also because she understands that investment in early childhood education is an investment in our future. Now, when we came into government, it was very clear that this was a sector that was in dire need of reform after a decade of neglect. And our reform agenda has three key pillars: tackling affordability, supply and accessibility, and workforce. And, Mr Speaker, we've made significant progress across all those three pillars. Over 1 million Australian families have saved thousands in out-of-pocket costs for early childhood education. And we continue to build on that by capping fee increases as part of our wage increase for early childhood workers. Around 200,000 early childhood workers are eligible for a 15% wage increase, and that's had a significant impact on workforce retention. Advertisements for vacancy rates are now down by 22%. Early childhood workers are now earning more and, with our tax cuts, keeping more of what they earn. Since we came into office, there are now over 97,000 more children in early childhood education, 41,900 more educators in the sector, and an increase in supply of more than 1,000 services. Our fee-free TAFE is helping to train more educators, and our workforce package has supported them to access professional development and complete their practicums. And, Mr Speaker, we're investing $1 billion to help build the early learning services in the regions and in the suburbs where children are currently missing out. Our 3-day guarantee, which I introduced into Parliament yesterday, ensures that every child has access to 72 hours a fortnight of early learning, regardless of their parents' activity. As I said, Mr Speaker, we have made significant progress on our reforms. Progress working towards our vision of a universal early learning system for every child, for every family, for every community. And, Mr Speaker, I'm also asked about what could put this at risk. The risk is that the Coalition, who threatened to leave families worse off and take us back to the days of higher out-of-pocket expenses, back to the days of low wages and an unsustainable workforce in early childhood education. The Coalition does not have a policy, a plan or a vision for families or for early childhood education. But, Mr Speaker, they do have one for CEOs. We'll invest $1 billion in building early learning. They'll spend billions on free lunches for bosses.
Before I call the member for Hume, the member for Moncrieff has had a pretty good go for those interjections, around 13 during that answer, so she is now warned. Shadow Treasurer has the call.
My question is to the Treasurer. Can the Treasurer confirm that the cost of gas has risen 34% during Labor's cost of living crisis since the election of the Albanese Labor government?
The Minister for Social Services will cease interjecting. The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Imagine asking about gas prices when they came in here at the end of the first year we were in government and voted against our gas caps, Mr Speaker.
Exactly.
Imagine being so slow on the uptake. Imagine being so slow on the uptake that he comes in here and he asks about gas prices. When Australians needed you to act on gas prices, you were nowhere to be found. And the reason that's top of mind, Mr Speaker, is because in the same legislation they also voted against electricity bill relief, Mr Speaker. At the end of 2022, when we were dealing with the fallout of the last Energy Minister, now the Shadow Treasurer, we came in here and we asked the whole Parliament to side with the Australian people, to put caps on gas prices and to help with electricity bills, and they were nowhere to be found. They were nowhere to be found. And they've got form on that front, Mr Speaker. It wasn't just gas prices where they abandoned Middle Australia. They abandoned Middle Australia on tax cuts. They abandoned Middle Australia on cheaper early childhood education, as my ministerial colleague was telling you about a moment ago. They abandoned Middle Australia on rent assistance. Right across the board, when it comes to the cost of living, they have been nowhere to be found, Mr Speaker.
Treasurer will pause. The Shadow Treasurer, members on my right, the member for Swan, the manager on a point of order.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. The point of order is on relevance. It was a very tight question. It didn't invite the Treasurer to critique other aspects of policy. He's straying a long way from the question. I'd ask you to invite him back to the question, or if he can't add anything further, to be seated.
Even though the question invited, I guess, a yes-no response, the Treasurer needs to make his answer directly relevant and not stray into too much alternative policy, because he wasn't asked anything about alternative policy. So I'll need to direct him back to the question to make sure he is on topic, and if he has the ability to do so, otherwise he'll have to resume his seat.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Across all of the components of inflation, what we've seen in the aggregate measures is that in the aggregate measures, inflation is lower under our government than it was when we came to office, what we inherited from those opposite, Mr Speaker. And so that is a fact. I mean, it's an inconvenient fact for the Shadow Treasurer, who was very unhappy when inflation went down again last Wednesday and is expressing his unhinged unhappiness in the chamber today, Mr Speaker. Now, the point that I'm making is the whole parliament acknowledges that there are price pressures in our economy, but only this side of the parliament is doing something about it. And we invited you in good faith at the end of 2022 to work with us and vote with us to do something about gas prices and to do something about electricity prices, and you voted against it. And worse, from memory, you went on with David Spears on an interview not that long after and pretended you voted for it. You told him that you voted for it. You were wrong about that as well, Mr Speaker. Now, inflation was higher and rising when we came to office. It's lower and falling now. We're making progress in the fight against inflation. We're helping with the cost of living. We know that you don't want a part of that. We know that you'd rather prices go up. We know that you'd rather inflation go up because it helps you politically. We've got a different set of interests and a different set of priorities. We've been there for Australians during this cost of living challenges. We will continue to be there for Australians. They would have been worse off if you had your way, and they'll be worse off still if you win the election.
Just remind the Treasurer to direct his comments through the chair. Give a call to the honourable member for Swan.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Education Minister. What is the Albanese Labor government doing to cut student debt? Are there any approaches that would leave Australians worse off?
Call to the Minister for Education.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. And can I thank my friend, the absolutely sensational member for Swan, for her question. Mr Speaker, if Labor wins the election, we'll cut student debt by 20%. And that will help 3 million Australians right across the country, including 21,000 Australians in the member for Swan's electorate. The average student debt there is $28,000. That means if we win the election, on average, they'll get more than $5,600 wiped off their debt. Incidentally, it also includes more than 20,000 Australians in the Leader of the Opposition's electorate. The average debt there is almost $26,000. If we win, they'll be more than $5,000 better off, wiped off their debt. And it also includes more than 25,000 Australians in the electorate of Sturt. There, the average debt is almost $30,000. That means if Labor wins, they'll get almost $6,000 wiped off their debt. And it also includes 31,000 people in the electorate of Griffith. There, the average debt is more than $30,000. If Labor wins, more than $6,000 will be wiped off their student debt. And we think that's good. We think that's a good idea. The Liberals think it's terrible. They've described this as a terrible idea. We want to cut your student debt. What do they want to do instead? They want to cut the cost of lunches for bosses. We're looking to the future. They can't see past lunchtime. If we win, $5,000 off your debt. If they win, $20,000 off the boss's lunch. That's it, Mr Speaker. That's a lot of crock and bush. That's a lot of crock and bush. $1.6 billion each and every year. That's a lot of crock and bush. That's a lot of caviar. That's a lot of deductible degustation. And when the opposition leader was asked about this just 2 weeks ago at a press conference in Goulburn, he said this about this $1.6 billion a year. It's quite an efficient use of taxpayers' money.
Order. Order. Member for Hawke. Order. Members on my right will cease interjecting immediately so the manager can make his point of order.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. Point of order is on relevance. It cannot be relevant to a question on education, the path that the minister's going down, particularly with pre-prepared answers before question time. So I'd ask you.
Yeah. I'm just going to ask the minister to return back to the question. He wasn't asked about alternative approaches, but he was talking about any approaches that would leave Australians worse off. So just get him back to the question and not to stray too far to assist the House.
Well, Mr Speaker, if we win the election, we'll cut student debt by 20%. That'll leave 3 million Australians better off. If they win the election, they won't get that. They'll be worse off. Instead, that money will be spent on bosses' lunches. That's the difference. And the opposition leader says that he thinks $1.6 billion on bosses' lunches is an efficient use of taxpayers' money. Doesn't say that about Medicare, doesn't say that about childcare, but apparently cut price crock and bush for bosses, that's chef's kiss. I think most Australians will think it's a crock or something else.
When the House comes to order, we shall hear from the Shadow Treasurer.
My question is to the Treasurer. Can the Treasurer confirm that the cost of insurance has risen 19% during Labor's cost of living crisis since the election of the Albanese Labor government?
Order. The Minister for Climate Change and Energy is warned. The member for Leichhardt will cease interjecting. And the Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Insurance has been one of the big drivers of the inflation challenge in our economy. And even as we've made some really quite substantial progress in a lot of the other categories, and insurance, I think from memory, came off a little bit in the most recent data, it is still a big and prominent part of the CPI. It is a big and prominent part of the CPI. Now, the Shadow Treasurer has raised this as a challenge. I think we'd already acknowledged in a number of different ways, my colleagues and I, the challenge of higher insurance premiums. I think we're seeing with more and more frequent natural disasters, including the one that we're seeing in North and far North Queensland play out right now, that that's having an impact on premiums. And so as the Shadow Treasurer keeps chirping away as I try and give him an answer to his question, I assume then that he has some kind of policy to deal with higher insurance premiums. And if he doesn't, then he should say so, Mr Speaker. The only policy those opposite have when it comes to natural disasters is to include it in the $350 billion of what they describe as wasteful spending. Now, in the mid-year budget update that I released with Minister Gallagher, one of the pressures on the budget, which they describe as wasteful, is another couple of $1 billion for natural disaster recovery. And he asked me, what does natural disasters have to do with insurance? He asked me, what's insurance got to do with natural disasters, he asked me.
Members on my
and doesn't that just say it all, Mr Speaker, about the poor quality of those opposite? We're funding natural disaster relief and response. We're getting inflation down, Mr Speaker, at the same time as we acknowledge that insurance is a big part of the CPI basket, and if he's got any ideas or alternatives about how to get those premiums down, he should tell the House.
Order. Order. We'll hear from the member for Blair.
Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development and Local Government. What is the Albanese Labor government doing to improve safety and productivity on Queensland roads? And are there any other approaches to infrastructure that would leave Australians worse off?
Call to the Minister for Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development and Local Government.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And can I thank the member for Blair for that question? He is a magnificent advocate for the people of Ipswich. I know, whether it comes from road funding, community infrastructure funding, he is the best representative the people of Blair have. Earlier in the year, I was very proud to be able to stand alongside the Prime Minister and the Treasurer in Gympie to announce the single largest ever investment into the Bruce Highway by any government, an additional $7.2 billion to bring the entire length of the highway up to a 3-star safety rating. Historic funding that will fast-track critical projects along the entire length of the corridor, but particularly concentrating on the worst areas first. Of course, we've seen this week the incredible importance of the Bruce Highway when it comes to the national supply chain. It's been highlighted this week with the floods up in the north. And I want to assure the House that the Albanese government is working closely with the Queensland government to ensure that we get that freight route up as soon as possible and that we have a long-term resilient solution for that stretch of road. But and we've seen the Prime Minister is there today. The significant increases in infrastructure investment that this government has made are all possible because of the hard work that we have done. Work to drive down inflation, to increase wages, to keep unemployment low, but to also ensure that we get the economy moving and we make sure that we do that after a decade, frankly, of neglect when it came to infrastructure. We've worked to drive inflation down, increase wages, and all of that has been important for the economy. But much of this investment is, of course, at risk if those opposite have their way, because their math simply just does not add up. You can't say, on the one hand, that you'll be making $350 billion worth of cuts without cutting funding to projects like the Bruce Highway, and you can't fund $600 billion of publicly owned nuclear reactors without cutting road and rail infrastructure spending. And you can't forego $1.6 billion to $10 billion a year in taxpayer-funded long lunches without substantially cutting infrastructure spending. The Leader of the Opposition, of course, let the cat out of the bag on Sunday when he confirmed that he would be making huge cuts if he gets his way. But what we do know is he's refusing to tell anybody before the election what those cuts were going to be. No matter what way you look at it, you'll be worse off under those opposite if this bloke has his way, and that includes when it comes to the significant investments this government has made in infrastructure funding.
Call to the Honourable the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
My question is to the Minister for Environment and Water. Does the Minister still support the introduction of a federal environmental protection agency, including in Western Australia?
Order. Give a call to the Minister for the Environment and Water.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I am so delighted to get this question from the Deputy Leader of the Opposition. She is one of the strongest advocates for environmental law reform. She, in fact, was the leader of the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, as I said at the beginning. As I said at the beginning, the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Order.
There's a difference between strong and aggro. The aggro is constantly.
Order. No, the minister's just going to order. We're going to cease interjections on the left, and the minister's just going to return back to the question.
Thank you. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition was the Environment Minister for a time. Many people don't remember that, but she was. And it was the Deputy Leader of the Opposition when Professor Graham Samuel presented the previous government with his review of John Howard's broken environmental laws that made a strong case that our laws did indeed need reforming.
Well, the Minister was answering the question, giving context around, I guess, what she's talking about, the EPBC, but I'll hear from the Deputy Leader.
A point of order on relevance, Mr Speaker, and I respectfully submit that the Minister was going nowhere near the question, which was quite straightforward and quite simple. Does she still support the introduction of a federal EPA, including in Western Australia?
Order. Order. We just don't need the commentary when people are on their feet asking with their entitlement to raise a point of order. So the Minister's had 1 minute. She is being directly relevant. She's giving some historical context, but I'll ask her to return to the question she was asked about to make sure she's being directly relevant so she can answer the Deputy Leader's question.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I will, and I'll just go to the Deputy Leader of the Opposition's exact quote in 2021. The Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act 1999 is 20 years old and needs modernising to ensure Australia can meet current and future environment and heritage protection challenges. Mr Speaker, we made very clear through our Nature Positive plan and through our laws that we wanted to see progress. Progress to deliver stronger protection for nature and progress to provide faster, clearer decisions for business. There's no business in the country that believes the environment laws are working to progress projects quickly, and there's no environmental organisation or anyone with any common sense that thinks that our laws are working to protect nature effectively either. Now, sadly, we took a very balanced package through the House of Representatives. We took it to the Senate. Unfortunately, the Liberals and the Nationals once again teamed up with the Greens political party to delay and to obfuscate and to refuse to make progress on our environmental law reforms, which would have delivered a strong, independent EPA with strong new powers and penalties, but would have also delivered faster, clearer decisions for business based on greater regional planning, more transparency, more data and clearer decision-making processes. Sadly, the Senate we have at the moment doesn't allow us to progress every piece of legislation that we put to it, and we've taken the legislation off the notice paper because we see that the deliberate delays and denial of those opposite, teamed up with the Greens political party, means that there was no pass-through in this parliament.
Has concluded. Call to member for Patterson.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Industry and Science. How is the Albanese Labor government helping deliver greater job security for regional communities that make aluminium? What approaches would leave these families worse off?
Call to the Minister for Industry and Science.
Thanks, Speaker, and thanks to the member for Patterson, who is a big backer of regional manufacturing and in particular knows that aluminium, making aluminium in the Hunter, happened for decades. It's been a big deal for the region. As the member for Patterson says, the products that are made there, they end up everywhere. So many jobs in smelters across regional Australia, from Gladstone in Queensland, Tomago in New South Wales, Portland in Victoria and Bell Bay in Tasmania. In the Albanese government, we want those blue-collar jobs to last for decades further, providing a secure future for blue-collar workers. And we worked with industry, with unions, with others to come up with a pathway to make aluminium well into the future, investing $2 billion in production credits to help not only make aluminium with lower emissions, but open up stronger exports in the future, because metals produced in this way could open up exports to the tune of $122 billion a year. So it's a big deal. It's an incredible opportunity. We've got the resources, we've got the people, we've got the smelters, and we've got the ability to add value across the breadth of the supply chain. Now, the Australian Aluminium Council says our investment's globally significant. Kelly Tarker, the CEO of Rio Tinto, put it this way: it's a belief in manufacturing, a belief in jobs, belief in aluminium industry. And when you talk to industry, they get it. The workers get it. Workers like those at Alcoa in Portland, and the member for Wannan's electorate, who remarkably described our announcement as all sizzle, no sausage. And all sizzle, no sausage. It's always about lunch with these folks. Always about lunch.
Order.
He says our investment. He says our investment won't work. Now, this is the same member for Wannon who 4 years ago was boasting about the then Morrison government's support for Portland to transition to low-carbon electricity. So it's good then, it's not good now. Now, we backed it because this is the big difference. We back manufacturing because it's in the national interest. They only back it when it's in their political interest.
That's right.
And so, straight away, and we had the self-styled tough guy of Australian politics, the Leader of the Opposition, who turns up and instantly bags it out. We know that this is instantly under threat by the Leader of the Opposition and the cuts that he needs to make to fund a $600 billion taxpayer-funded nuclear power plant scheme. It's not on. And, on top of that, it's not good enough that they will not tell Australians where they will make the cuts until after the election. It's not just gutless, it lacks respect and it cannot be backed.
The call to the member for Goldstein.
Thank you, Speaker. To the Deputy Prime Minister. Last week I met with Holly Moreton-Bowles' father, Sean. Holly and her friend Bianca died after consuming bootleg alcohol in Laos last year. Their families are desperate for information about the investigation into what happened and whether anyone will be held responsible. They're also concerned about protecting other young travellers like their precious girls. Can you please advise the House what progress has been made on this important matter?
Call to the Deputy Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for her question. I also thank her for her advocacy in giving voice to the families of Holly Moreton-Bowles and Bianca Jones. What happened to Holly and Bianca struck at the heart of the nation, and all of us stand in the embrace of her families, and it is unimaginable to think about what they are going through in facing the loss of their beautiful daughters. And what is understandable is a desire on their part, as you have raised here, to find out more information, but ultimately to find out who did this terrible act and to see the perpetrators of this crime brought to justice and held to account. This is an investigation which is being undertaken by the authorities in Laos. The Australian Federal Police have made an offer to the authorities in Laos to provide their assistance in the investigation, and there is a whole lot of capability that the Australian Federal Police could bring to bear in terms of this investigation. I have to report, sadly, to the House that at this point the Laos authorities have not taken up that invitation on the part of, or that offer on the part of the Australian Federal Police. But I would want to assure the families of Bianca and Holly that we remain in contact with the Lao authorities and that the offer of assistance is being consistently offered and raised with the Lao authorities. But beyond that, I want to make this point as well. The Minister for Foreign Affairs has spoken to her counterpart in Laos and made clear that it is the expectation of the Australian government that there be a thorough investigation into these events, into this crime, and that the perpetrators be found. And that is the expectation in the context of our relationship with Laos, that happened. And that has been directly related by the Minister for Foreign Affairs to her counterpart, and we will continue to press Laos to pursue this investigation, as we will continue to offer the assistance of the Australian Government through the Australian Federal Police in this investigation. The Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade have been in contact with Bianca and Holly's families, and they will continue to do so. Obviously, any information that we have, we want to share with them. But I really do want to finish in thanking and acknowledging you for your advocacy on their behalf. I know it means a lot to them, but it means a lot to this House and it means a lot to this nation.
Give a call to the member for Hasluck.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Veteran Affairs and Defence Personnel. How has the Albanese Labor government improved the lives of Australians' veterans? Is the Minister aware of proposals that would leave veterans worse off?
The call to the Minister for Veterans Affairs and the Minister for Defence Personnel.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the hard-working member for Hasluck for her question and for her advocacy and engagement in the veteran community in her part of Perth and Western Australia. The Leader of the Opposition has been saying workers who provide government services are government waste, and he has been saying that he wants to cut the 36,000 public service roles. But when the Liberals left office, DVA was under-resourced, and there were some 42,000 veteran claims that were not even being looked at by the Department of Veterans Affairs, which meant that veterans were waiting for years to have their claims processed. Now, the Albanese Labor government
we've engaged some additional 500 claims processing staff in the Department of Veterans Affairs. And that's allowed us to make sure that veterans and families are able to get the entitlements that not only they need, but they deserve and were not getting under the previous Liberal government. By properly resourcing the Department of Veterans Affairs, veterans are receiving some $13 billion in benefits that they deserved but were not receiving under the previous government. Now, new veteran claims are with DVA being looked at by somebody within 14 days. And over the last 12 months, initial liability claims on average are being processed within just a few months. Back in the last financial year of the previous government, 2021-22, there were some 53,508 veteran claims determined, compared to the last financial year, 2023-24, where there were over 100,000 claims determined for veterans. The Leader of the Opposition says that we need to look after our veterans, but then also says that he wants to cut the vital staff that process their DVA claims, calling them waste. Our priority is delivering services and support for those that have served our nation, not serving bosses long lunches at taxpayer expense. If the Leader of the Opposition thinks that DVA staff are waste, what then does he also think of our veterans? Under the Leader of the Opposition, Australian veterans will be worse off.
Order. Give a call to the Leader of the Nationals.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for the Environment and Water, and I refer the Minister to her previous answer. Will the Minister rule out the future introduction of the Federal Environmental Protection Bill?
The call to the Minister for the Environment and Water.
Well, I thank the Leader of the Nationals for his question, and it's pretty clear what our plan was. The legislation passed through this parliament, through the House of Representatives, with the support of many of those on the crossbench and Labor. We introduced it into the Senate. We couldn't get it through the Senate. That's a shame. Many of us are very disappointed about that, but it hasn't gone through the Senate. It won't go through the Senate in this parliament. We've withdrawn it from the notice paper. I think for many Australians watching this debate, they would be very disappointed that this parliament couldn't do what everybody in this parliament acknowledges is necessary, which is sensible environmental law reform based on the report of Professor Graham Samuel to the previous government. Professor Graham Samuel was selected by the previous government to report on our environmental laws. And what did he find? He found that those laws are not working for business and they're not working for nature.
Has the Minister concluded her answer?
Yeah. I've finished.
Give it order. Order. The Leader of the Opposition and the Minister for the Environment do not need to continue the conversation once an answer is completed. So when the House comes to order, we shall hear from the member for McEwen.
My question is to the Minister for Immigration. What has the Albanese Labor government done to get rid of dodgy visa programs, and are there any proposals that would undermine the system?
Call to the Leader of the House. Member for Barker is not to interject. There's no point pointing to someone else. I heard you interjecting. Okay. Well, you may sit further away, but I can still hear you. Trust me. So, we're just going to remain silent for the remainder of this answer because I want to hear what the Leader of the House has to say.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. And I want to thank the member for McEwen for raising what's an important issue. Because soon after we came to the office, my predecessor had commissioned the Nixon Review, and the Nixon Review was presented to this government and found serious problems with the integrity of the visa system which we had inherited. It found that the visa system, as it had been administered by previous ministers, including the now Leader of the Opposition, that they had overseen mass exploitation of vulnerable individuals, as well as syndicates running brothels and engaging in sexual exploitation, even human trafficking. When you ask, well, what was happening with compliance, because we're hearing about some of the services that are provided by Australian workers need to be cut. Well, there's form there, because you can guess which part of the workforce the cuts were made in immigration. From 360 down to 203, that was the compliance division. Cuts in the compliance division. Now, there are different visas where you qualify in different ways. The fact that you are married might qualify you for a partner visa. The fact that you have particular skills might qualify you for a work visa. The way you qualify for a significant investor visa is that you have cash. That is how you qualify for that visa. So when I use the term, I am not using the term in the sense of the Howard government scandals, a government the Leader of the Opposition was part of, but the significant investor visa is a visa designed to be cash for visa. We have seen the comments, and some of which I read out the other day, from Magnitsky Act founder Sir Bill Browder. Now, those opposite didn't like some of the comments that I read from him, so I'll read some different comments from him. The Albanese government should hold firm on good policies that are in place for good reasons, referring specifically to our abolition of the visa that the Leader of the Opposition wants to bring back. He went on to say, the Magnitsky Act is designed to prevent kleptocrats and human rights violators from coming into the country, and now you have somebody who wants to propose a fast track for potential kleptocrats to come into the country. It makes no sense. He went on to say, as the rest of the world closes down these loopholes, Australia is going to get more of these people because they're not welcome elsewhere. This level of reckless arrogance shows the twisted priorities we have seen just today. Today, in an interview, he doubled down on wanting to bring back a discredited visa. He's wanted today to divert police resources from an active investigation, and Senator Hughes has criticised for the first time a Prime Minister from being on the ground during a natural disaster.
The Leader of the House. Time has concluded. Order. Give the call to the honourable member for Wentworth.
This is a question for the Minister for representing the Minister for Industrial Relations. Small businesses in Wentworth are really struggling, and one of the main reasons is complex regulation that has gotten worse this term. Members of the crossbench wrote to the government to raise the threshold of the definition of small business from 15 to 25 workers. Now, this isn't expected to cost $125, $1.6 billion or even $10 billion a year. Will the government support this reasonable and measurable practical implementation of a policy that would support small business?
Call to the Leader of the House and the Minister representing the Minister for Workplace Relations.
Thank you. I thank the member for Wentworth for the question and acknowledge that the member for Wentworth has been relentless in advocating for small business, which has often caused us to have different views on my legislation. Some of the legislation that I introduced when I was the Minister, when it was introduced, did not have a large number of small business exemptions. By the time it went through the parliament, it did. The question that the member for Wentworth goes to is whether the threshold as to how you define small business in workplace relations legislation should be changed. There are a series of different definitions of small business in different pieces of legislation, as most members are aware. What needs to be remembered when people have their own common sense view of what a small business is under workplace relations legislation, overwhelmingly in those figures, casuals are not counted. So when you consider a workplace that has 16 employees, that may in fact represent a much larger workplace. And if you were to take that to 25, there are a good number, a very good number, particularly of highly casualised workplaces, which no reasonable person would consider to be small businesses, which would suddenly find the workforce there exempt from a whole lot of rights that this parliament has decided workers should have. We want to make sure that we get the balance right in providing the distinction between acknowledging the different pressures that small business is under, particularly with paperwork, but making sure that the definitions are realistic. Because with every exemption, it carries two consequences. One, it does mean for those businesses they do have an easier compliance burden. That's true. But it does also mean that the workers who work there have fewer rights than they would have in another business. Making the change in definition is a very big step, and given the way many businesses are structured with respect to casuals, that's why we have not been supporting a change in that number.
Call to the Chief Government Whip.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. What action has the Albanese Labor government taken to tackle the public health menace of vaping? Are there any other approaches to regulating tobacco and vaping that would leave Australians worse off? And how has the tobacco industry responded?
Give the call to the Minister for Health and Aged Care.
Well, thanks to my friend the member for Lawler for that question. She remembers that vaping was presented to our community and others around the world as a therapeutic device that would help hardened smokers kick the habit. But years on, we now know that was all a lie. What Big Tobacco really wanted was to recruit a new generation to nicotine addiction and then to cigarettes. And the tragedy, Mr Speaker, is that it's been working. Over recent years, the number of teenagers and young people in Australia vaping has absolutely exploded, ingesting hundreds of dangerous chemicals into their young lungs. And we now know that a high school student who vapes is 5 times as likely to take up cigarettes. A 12-year-old who vapes, and there are a number of them, is 29 times as likely to take up cigarettes. So while the former government sat on their hands while this has exploded around them, we have been determined to act, Mr Speaker. And since then, we have seized millions of disposable vapes at the border, taking them out of the hands of young Australians. Vape stores have closed around the country, and we've conducted hundreds of joint operations with state governments to target those retailers who are still determined to breach the law. But I know people are asking, what does this mean for vaping rates? People are asking, what does it mean for vape rates? And as our kids return to school, I'm pleased to report to Australia's parents, if not for this member, that we've turned the corner on vaping in this country, Mr Speaker. Last month, the Sydney University reported the highest number of high school students who've never vaped and never smoked that they'd ever seen in all of their research. And last week, a large yearly survey found that the number of young people in Australia vaping over the last 12 months has dropped by 30%. The number of people over 30 years old has dropped by 50%. And amazingly, the number of kids suspended from school for vaping has plummeted by a half, which begs the question, Mr Speaker, why is the Coalition so determined to roll back our laws and bring back the vapes? Well, at the same time we announced our determination to crack down on vaping, you wouldn't guess who emerged from the shadows and fired up their donations again to the Coalition. Right. British American Tobacco. Right. Deirdre Chambers, what a coincidence. $360,000 over the last 2 years to the Coalition, more than they donated in the past 18 years combined. 18 years combined. Now, I'm sure the Leader of the Opposition can explain what all of this means to Australia's parents and Australia's school leaders. But I tell you this, in the meantime, we'll be fighting Big Tobacco, not inviting them to dinner.
Call to the Deputy Prime Minister.
I ask that further questions be placed on the notice.